On the afternoon of September 4th, 1979, in Washington County, Vermont, a farmer named Pete Amsden watched his brand-new John Deere tractor tip over on the third row of his north hillside field and slide 40 feet down the slope before a rock outcropping stopped it. Pete was not on the tractor when it went. He had jumped clear the moment he felt the uphill wheels begin to lift. The specific, terrifying sensation of a machine that has found the edge of its stability and gone past it, the whole weight shifting in a direction that nothing on earth was going to redirect. He had gone over the left side and rolled and come up on his hands and knees in the hay stubble with the tractor already past him, already moving, already making the sound a 5-ton machine makes when it is going somewhere it was not meant to go. He sat in the stubble on the hillside and looked at his tractor. It had come to rest on its right side against a granite outcropping at the edge of the field, engine still running, one rear wheel spinning slowly in the September air. The cab had taken the impact. The glass was gone. The roll cage had done its job. The cab was crushed, but it had held. If Pete had stayed on that machine, he would have been alive, but he would not have been comfortable. He was unhurt. The tractor was not. He sat on the hillside for a while looking at the machine and thinking about the specific sequence of decisions that had brought him to this moment. He had bought the tractor in the spring. It was the most powerful and most modern machine he had ever owned. 94 horsepower, power shift, air conditioning in the cab, GPS guidance that he had not yet learned to use fully. It had cost $95,000 financed over 7 years. He had bought it to work the hill ground he had recently leased from the Gagne estate, 18 acres of steep Washington County hillside that his valley operation needed for additional hay ground. He had been on the third row of that hill ground when the right side lifted. The tractor had been designed for flat ground and moderate slopes. The operator's manual specified a maximum safe operating slope of 15 degrees. The north hillside field on the Gagne place ran 30 to 35 degrees. Pete had not measured the slope before he drove onto it. He had looked at the hill and decided it was workable and driven on. It was workable. It was not workable for that machine. From where he sat on the hillside, he could see 100 yards to the east along the same slope, a small green shape moving slowly and steadily along the contour of the hill. Hector Gagne, 64 years old, on his 1938 Oliver 70, working the same hillside, the same 35-degree slope, on the same September afternoon, moving at the pace of a man who has all the time he needs because the machine beneath him has been doing this specific job for 41 years and has never once come close to the edge of anything. Pete sat in the stubble and watched the old Oliver work the hill. Let me tell you about Hector Gagne, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what his grandfather built into that machine. Hector was 64 years old in the fall of 1979. He had farmed the same 95 acres in Washington County his entire adult life, working hillside ground that most Vermont farmers considered marginal, and that the Gagne family had been farming since Hector's great-grandfather cleared it in 1881. The farm ran dairy on the valley floor and hay on the hill slopes, the way Washington County hill farms ran, because the hill ground was too steep for anything but hay, and the dairy needed the hay, and the system had worked for 100 years. What made it work? What had always made it work on ground this steep was the 1938 Oliver 70 sitting in the equipment shed behind the barn. Alphonse Gagne, Hector's grandfather, had bought that Oliver in the fall of 1938 for $340 cash. He had not bought it randomly. He had spent 2 years watching the tractor market, reading the specifications of every machine available in Vermont, and doing a calculation that no equipment dealer he talked to had ever considered relevant. He was calculating center of gravity. Alphonse had farmed hillside ground in Washington County his whole life, first with horses and then with the early gasoline tractors that came available in the 1920s. He had watched 2 neighboring farmers tip their tractors on slopes he regularly worked. He had watched one of them die. The other had survived with injuries that ended his farming career. Alphonse had understood from those 2 events that a tractor on a hillside was not a productivity tool. It was a survival question. The machine that could work his hill ground was not the most powerful machine or the most modern machine. It was the machine with the lowest center of gravity and the widest stance and the least likelihood of putting its operator on the wrong side of the physics. He had brought a carpenter's level to the Oliver dealership in Montpelier. He had measured the height of the engine block from the ground. He had measured the rear axle width. He had calculated, with the specific arithmetic of a man who had watched someone die on a hillside, the theoretical rollover threshold of the machine at various slope angles. The Oliver 70 had the best numbers he found. Its chassis sat lower than any comparable machine. Its rear axle was wider relative to its height than any other option. Its rollover threshold on a 30-degree slope was meaningfully higher than the alternatives. He paid $340 and drove it home. He used it on the hill ground for 31 years, until 1969, when his health made the open platform hill work too demanding. He handed it to Hector with one instruction: keep it for the hill. Nothing else goes up there. Hector had kept it for the hill for 41 more years by the time Pete Amsden's tractor came off the slope on September 4th. Let me tell you about Pete Amsden, because you need to understand what he had and what he was trying to do with it. Pete had been farming in Washington County since 1971, when he bought 80 acres of valley ground from a retiring farmer and started building a dairy operation. He was a hard worker and a good manager of flat ground, and by 1979 he had grown the dairy to 60 head and the flat acreage to 200 acres, and he needed more hay ground. The Gagne Hillside parcel had become available when Hector leased it out rather than farming it himself. His own equipment situation had changed, and he was working reduced acres. Pete leased the 18 acres for $140 per year. He looked at it in the spring, and he saw hay ground. He did not look at it the way Alphonse had looked at it, reading the slope, measuring the angle, calculating the center of gravity of anything he was going to drive onto it. He looked at it the way a man looks at ground when he has a machine he trusts and assumes the machine can handle whatever the ground presents. He drove the $95,000 John Deere onto the North Hillside field on September 4th, 1979, on the third cut of the season. The first 2 cuts had been done by a custom haying crew with a smaller, older tractor that had worked the slope without incident, though Pete had not noticed that the custom crew's machine was significantly lower to the ground than his own. He had watched them work and seen hay cut and thought nothing else about it. On the third cut, with Pete himself on the machine, the slope took the decision away from him. The equipment dealer in Barra heard about the incident 2 days later through the specific rapid telegraph of Vermont farming communities. He drove out to look at the tractor on a Thursday morning. He walked the hillside with Pete and looked at the resting place of the machine against the granite outcropping and shook his head. 35 degrees, the dealer said. I would not put this machine on 35 degrees. Pete looked at him. What would you put on 35 degrees? The dealer looked up the hill to where Hector's 1938 Oliver was visible in the equipment shed. He knew what it was. He looked back at Pete. Something older, he said. Something built lower. He paused. Something built for this. Pete did not understand yet, but he would. Let me pause here and tell you about center of gravity on a hillside, because it is the physics underneath this story, and you cannot understand the story without understanding the physics. A tractor on a hillside is always trying to tip. Gravity pulls the machine's weight straight down. On flat ground, that pull goes straight through the tractor into the ground, and the machine is stable. On a slope, the geometry changes. The center of gravity, the point where all the tractor's weight is effectively concentrated, is no longer directly above the support base formed by the 4 tire contact points. It is offset toward the downhill side. The steeper the slope, the greater the offset. When the center of gravity moves far enough that a vertical line dropped from it falls outside the rectangle formed by the 4 tire contact points, the machine tips. Nothing can stop it once that point is crossed. The driver can cut the throttle, turn the wheel, pray. None of it matters. The physics has already made the decision. The height of the center of gravity matters enormously in this equation. A low center of gravity, an engine block close to the ground, a chassis that sits low, means the offset happens more slowly as the slope increases. More slope is required to push the center of gravity outside the support base. A high center of gravity, a tall engine, a high chassis clearance, a heavy cab mounted above the axles, means the offset happens quickly. A slope that a low machine handles comfortably will tip a high machine. Modern tractors are taller than tractors from the 1930s. They have higher chassis clearance, bigger engines mounted higher, enclosed cabs that add weight above the axle line. They are more powerful, more comfortable, more capable in every way except one. Their center of gravity is higher. On a hillside, that is the only specification that matters. The 1938 Oliver 70 sat 6 inches lower than Pete Amsden's new John Deere at the engine block. 6 inches. The rear axle was 4 inches wider relative to the chassis height. The rollover threshold on a 35-degree slope was the difference between a machine working and a machine going over. Alphonse had calculated this in 1938 with a carpenter's level and paper arithmetic. The physics had not changed since then. Now, let me tell you about the afternoon Pete came to Hector's barn, because that is where the conversation happened. Pete walked to the Gagne farm on a Saturday afternoon in September, 2 weeks after his tractor went over. The tractor was back from the dealer, repaired at a cost of $8,400. The cab replaced, the hydraulics checked, the frame straightened. Pete had driven it home from Bar and parked it in his machinery shed and had not yet decided what to do about the hillside field. He found Hector in the barn, adjusting the Oliver's rear wheel spacing with a wrench. Hector looked up when Pete came in. He looked back at the wheel and kept adjusting. Pete stood at the barn door for a moment. Then he said, "I need to understand something." Hector kept working. Pete walked to the Oliver and looked at it. The machine was low. He had driven past it 100 times on the road without looking at it directly. Now he looked at it. He crouched beside it and looked at the chassis height from the ground. He stood and looked at the rear axle width. He walked around it once. "How low is this thing?" Pete asked. Hector straightened up and looked at the Oliver. "Engine block sits 22 inches off the ground," he said. He looked at Pete. "Your machine?" Pete thought about it. He had not measured it. He guessed. Maybe 30, 32. Hector nodded. He put his wrench down. "My grandfather measured this machine before he bought it," he said, "brought a level to the dealership in Montpelier. He measured every tractor they had." He paused. This one was lowest. Pete looked at the Oliver. He was doing arithmetic he should have done before he leased that Hillside. "You knew that field was 35 degrees. Hector looked at him. "I have been working it since I was 12 years old." Pete looked at the machine. "I should have asked you before I drove up there." Hector picked up his wrench and went back to the wheel adjustment. "Yes," he said, "you should have." Pete watched him work. He was not a man who enjoyed sitting with the full weight of a mistake. He preferred to understand it and address it and move forward. He was beginning to understand this one. "Can I use this machine on the hill?" Pete asked. Hector stopped adjusting and looked at him. "Do you know how to run it?" "I can learn." Hector looked at the Oliver. Then he looked at Pete. "Come back tomorrow morning," he said. "I will show you." Pete came back the following morning. Hector spent 3 hours on the hillside with him, first walking the field together, Hector pointing out the places where the angle was steepest and the places where the rock outcroppings changed the drainage and made the soil slicker, the places where you slowed down and the places where you kept moving. Then they switched and Pete walked while Hector worked a demonstration pass, showing Pete the line he took and why, the way he positioned the machine on the contour, the constant small adjustments that kept the wide stance working for stability instead of against it. Then Hector got off and Pete got on. He drove 3 rows before Hector stopped him. Not because anything was wrong, because something was right that Pete did not yet recognize as right. "You feel the difference?" Hector asked. Pete sat on the Oliver's open platform, feeling the machine beneath him. It was lower. The seat was lower. The whole world was closer. He could feel the slope through the machine differently than he felt it through the enclosed cab of the John Deere, not mediated by suspension and soundproofing, but directly, the way you feel ground when you are close to it. "It feels like the hill is not as steep," Pete said. Hector looked at him over the wire-rimmed glasses. "It is not," he said. "Not for this machine." He put his hand on the rear fender. "Your machine was fighting the hill. This one was built for it." He paused. There is a difference between a machine working against its geometry and one working with it. Pete sat with that for a moment. Then he drove the next row. He worked the upper half of the north field that morning. He did not tip. He did not come close to tipping. The Oliver held the contour the way it had always held it, the way Alphonse had measured and calculated that it would hold it in 1938, the wide, low chassis distributing the machine's weight across the slope with the geometry that kept everything where it needed to be. If you want to know what Pete Amsden did at the end of that morning, and what he asked Hector about buying, subscribe to The Honest Farmer. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Tell me if anyone in your family ever farmed steep ground and what machine they trusted to do it. At the end of the morning, Pete climbed off the Oliver and stood beside it on the hillside. He looked at the rows behind him, straight and even across the 35-degree slope. He looked at the granite outcropping 40 feet below the third row, the place where his $95,000 tractor had come to rest on its side 6 weeks earlier. He looked at Hector. "What would you take for this machine?" Hector looked at the Oliver. "Not for sale." Pete nodded. He had expected that. "I need something like it for this ground," he said. "Where do I find one?" Hector looked at him over his glasses. He was quiet for a moment, the way he was always quiet before he said something that mattered. "You find them at estate auctions," he said. "Old farms selling off." He paused. "You need to know what you're looking for." "What am I looking for?" Hector crouched beside the Oliver and put his hand flat on the chassis rail 2 inches off the ground. "This," he said, "low." He straightened up. "And this." He spread his hands the width of the rear axle, wide. He looked at Pete. "Bring a measuring tape. Bring a carpenter's level." He looked at the hillside. "Your grandfather did not measure. Mine did." Pete looked at him. "My grandfather farmed flat ground in New Hampshire." Hector nodded. "Then you are the first generation on hill ground in your family," he said. He picked up his wrench. "Your grandfather did not have lessons to pass on about hills." He paused. "I do." He went back to work on the wheel. Pete drove to 4 estate auctions over the following 8 months. He brought a measuring tape and a carpenter's level, the same tools Alphonse had brought to Montpelier in 1938. He measured chassis height and axle width at every machine he looked at. He passed on 3 because the numbers were not right. The 4th was a 1941 Oliver 88 in Caledonia County, still running, owned by a farmer who had worked Vermont hillsides with it for 30 years and who told Pete before he left that the machine knew the ground better than any operator ever would. Pete paid $480 for it. He drove it home. He still has it. The John Deere goes on the flat ground. The Oliver goes on the hill. He has not tipped a machine on the North Hillside field since September 4th, 1979. Let me tell you about the years after, because this story does not end at an equipment shed door. Hector Gagne farmed his 95 acres until 1988, when his knees made the hill work impossible to manage safely. He leased the valley ground to Pete and let the hillside go fallow rather than risk it without the right operator on the Oliver. The Oliver stayed in the barn. Hector maintained it the way he always had. Oil changed, grease fittings packed, the wheel spacing adjusted seasonally, the carburetor cleaned every spring. He died in 1994 at the age of 79 in the farmhouse where he had been born, leaving the farm to his daughter Sylvie, who had grown up watching him work the hillside and who had driven the Oliver herself by the age of 14. Sylvie did not lease the hillside. She worked it herself with the Oliver, the same machine her grandfather Alphonse had bought in 1938, the same machine Hector had kept for 56 years. She had learned the hill from Hector the way Hector had learned it from Alphonse, by walking it first, reading the slope, understanding the places where the machine needed to be cautious and the places where it could work confidently. She still farms the hillside. The Oliver is 86 years old now. She has it maintained by a retired mechanic in Montpelier who knows the engine the way Alphonse knew it, from the bottom of the block up. It runs, it works the hill, it does not tip. Pete Amsden retired his own Oliver, the 1941-88 from Caledonia County in 2006. When the engine finally required a rebuild he did not want to invest in. He bought a 1953 Oliver Super 88 at an estate auction in Orleans County. He brought his measuring tape and his carpenter's level. The numbers were right. He paid $620. He called Hector's daughter Sylvie to tell her. She laughed, which was something Hector had never done, and said, "My grandfather would approve of you measuring it." Pete said, "I should have measured before I drove onto that hill in 1979. Sylvie said, "Yes, but you only make that mistake once." Pete thought about it. He thought about the carpenter's level Alphonse had brought to the Oliver dealership in Montpelier in 1938 and kept in the Gagne barn for 30 years. He thought about the piece of knowledge that level represented. Not that the Oliver was a good tractor, but that center of gravity was the only number that mattered on a Vermont hillside, and that you could measure it before you committed yourself to a machine and a slope. He thought about his grandfather farming flat ground in New Hampshire, never needing to know this, and about the first day he had driven onto a Vermont hillside and assumed the ground would accept whatever machine he brought to it. "The ground does not accept any machine," he said to Sylvie. "It only accepts the right one." Sylvie was quiet for a moment. "That is what my great-grandfather said," she told him. "Almost exactly. He said the hill does not care what you paid for the machine. It only cares where the center of gravity is." Pete hung up and went to start the 1953 Super 88. It took 2 pulls of the crank and settled into the low, steady rumble of an engine that has been maintained past the point where most people would have replaced it. He drove it to the barn and parked it beside the John Deere. The 2 machines sat side by side, the modern high-clearance powerful machine and the old low-slung wide-stance machine. And the difference between them was not age and not horsepower and not comfort. The difference was 6 inches of chassis height and 4 inches of axle width, and the specific gap those numbers created between a machine that would work the hill safely and one that would not. Alphonse Gagne had understood that in 1938. He had written it down, in a way, with a carpenter's level and a paid-for tractor, and 56 years of working the same hill without incident. Let me tell you the last thing, because it is the thing Alphonse would have wanted you to know. The carpenter's level is still in the Gagne barn. Sylvie knows where it is. She showed it to her own son when he was 12 years old, the same age Hector had been when Alphonse first took him onto the hillside, and she explained what it meant and why it was in the barn and what her great-grandfather had used it for. Her son is 17 now. He has driven the Oliver on the hill. He has learned the contours, the places where the slope is sharpest, the line along the field edge where the rock ledge changes the drainage and makes the soil slicker than it looks. He knows these things because Sylvie showed him the way Hector showed Sylvie the way Alphonse showed Hector. The Oliver is 86 years old, and it is still the machine that works the Gagne hillside. Not because it is sentimental, not because the family is attached to it, because the center of gravity is 22 inches off the ground and the rear axle is the right width, and the physics do not change with time or with sentiment or with the price of anything. The hill does not care what you paid. It cares where the weight is. Alphonse Gagne understood that in 1938 and brought a level to prove it. His grandson understood it because his grandfather taught him, His granddaughter understood it because Hector taught her. Her son is learning it now because Sylvie is teaching him. 5 generations on the same Vermont hillside, the same steep ground, the same machine, the same carpenter's level in the same barn. Some knowledge does not become obsolete. It waits in a barn for the next person who needs to understand why it matters. Subscribe to The Honest Farmer for more stories like this one. Stories of the machines built for specific ground that no general-purpose modern equipment can replace. Of the measurements taken before a purchase that saved lives across 3 generations. Of the farmers who understood that the right tool is not the most powerful tool. It is the tool with the right geometry for the specific problem you are trying to solve. Hit the bell so you do not miss the next one. Tell me in the comments, did your family ever farm steep ground? What machine did you trust on it and why? The Oliver is still in the barn. The carpenter's level is on the shelf beside it. The hill has not changed its angle in 86 years. It is still waiting for the machine that knows where its weight is.